Hi, welcome to this tutorial on Windows Communication Foundation. So this is a continuation of my previous tutorial. So in our previous tutorial we saw how to do a binding configuration in app config file as well as in the code. Okay. So now we will see in this tutorial we will see about behavior configuration. Okay. So why we need, what is a behavior or what is a behavior configuration? Okay, so when a client sends a message or sends a request to the service, okay, there should be something that converts the client object to a serialized format, SOAP based XML format. So that is, it is serialized, and then again in the client side it has to be deserialized, as well as there has to be some instance, something that should create an instance for the service and invoke the correct operation, okay, according to the client's request. Okay, so these are done using what we call it as dispatchers. Okay, so the dispatchers are responsible for deserializing, and creating an instance for the service and calling the correct operation. Okay, and configuring these dispatchers is done in, is called as behaviors. Okay, so these dispatchers have their own behaviors, but if you want to change the default behavior of a dispatcher, then we call it as behavior configuration. Okay, so configuring or changing the default behavior of a dispatcher is called as behavior configuration. So this behavior configuration can be done for a service or for an endpoint, okay, or for an operation. Okay, so certain behaviors we can do it in a app config file, but certain behaviors we can do it in a coding. Okay, so we will see how we can do this in a app config file as well as in a coding. So I will open my demo program. So first we will see how we can do that in our config file. So okay. So this is a continuation of my previous tutorial. So here you have a app config file. So we finished with configuring the binding, okay, by giving a binding configuration, changing the default values for a binding. Okay, so now we will see how we can do that for a service. Okay, so here in our service we can give our own behaviors. So I will give first we will go with service behavior configuration. Okay, so I give the name as my first service behave. Okay, so this is my name for my behavior configuration, and I can also give my own configuration for the endpoint behavior. Okay, so I give behavior my first endpoint behave. Okay, so what I have done here is I'm going to change the default behavior of my service. Okay, and I'm also going to change the default behavior of my endpoint. Okay, so I've given two names. I'm referring with these two names, my first service behave and my first endpoint behave. Okay, so I have an element here called as behaviors, and inside behaviors I have service behaviors as well as endpoint behaviors. Okay, so inside the service behavior I already have some behaviors here. Since initially I didn't give any names, it automatically took to my first service. So now I will just give it as a name, my first service behave. Okay, So what is my service going to behave? What is the behavior I've given for my service? It has to enable the HTTP, and it has to have a it has to have the debug include exceptions detail in false. Okay, so the exceptions are not included during false, and this behavior initially it took it automatically because I didn't give any name. Now I'm just referring with a name, that's all. Okay, and another one is I've given my endpoint behavior here. Okay, so I have to give behavior name of my endpoint behavior, my first behavior. So inside my endpoint behavior I can give some values. Okay, so I will give endpoint discovery uh, enabled equal to true. Okay, so what I've done is I would change the default behavior for my service. Okay, I've enabled the metadata, and I've done the include exception detail in false as false. Okay, and then I've given a behavior for my endpoint. Okay, so behavior, it gives a description about the host. Okay, it says what is your host, your host is, whether it is going to have multiple instances, or whether it is going to have concurrent calls. So all these are given inside behaviors. So behaviors we can define it either in a configuration file or in a code. Okay, so we have different behaviors: service behavior, endpoint behavior, operation behavior. Service behavior, endpoint behavior can be given in both in app config file as well as in your coding, but your operation behavior you might have to give only in your coding. Okay, so I'll just save this all and I will run. So my service is up and running. Okay, so there is no problem in my service. So I've changed the behavior of my service as well as my endpoint. Okay, so the same thing we will see how we can do it in a coding. Okay, so I will just close this, and so I have the same demo serialized program. Here we don't have anything in the config file, whereas we have done all the things in our, all the hosting, everything in our uh, program coding. Okay, so first we will see how to do the service behavior. So in the implementation part we have this implementation of the service. So here I give the service behavior. Okay, service behavior of, so service behavior, it takes care of few things, like we can give what is the, how many instances, how the instance has to be created. So I give instance context mode equal to context mode dot. So here you have three values: whether an instant has to be created for every call, or instant has to be created for a session, or one instance should be used for uh, throughout the project. Okay, for every call or every session only one instance is created and it is used every time. Okay, so I will just give for per call, for every call, then a new instance has to be created. And then I can give another property, concurrency. Say mode is equal to mode dot single, reentrant, or multiple. So this is mainly about how many threads, whether whether it will handle only a single thread at a time, whether the service is going to handle a single thread at a time or multiple thread at a time. Okay, so all these properties you can, I'm defining it in the code. Okay, and the endpoint properties you can give it in the hosting console. There we have the endpoint, and we have already given an endpoint behavior here for our metadata. Okay, so we have given the description, endpoint description, and we have enabled the metadata, but make sure that you have the namespace system.servicemodel.description. Okay, for the endpoint behavior. So we saw how we can give the behavior for a service in code. Okay, in the implementation part, and the endpoint in code here in my hosting console I've given. Okay, and the next one is how we can give the behavior for a operation. Okay, so suppose if I want to give some behavior for this particular operation, then I just go here and give operation behavior. Transaction autocomplete equal to true. Okay, so I am just giving some behavior for this particular operation alone. Okay, so all these you can do it in your code. So service behavior and endpoint behavior, you can do it in your coding as well as in your config file, but when it comes to operation behavior, you have to go do it in your coding part. Okay, so I'll just give save all. Okay, so this is about how you can give your behavior for behaviors. Behaviors are normally a description about your service or your endpoint and about your operation. Okay, so you can change the description, the default values for your dispatcher, and changing the default values you have to give it inside a behavior. Okay, so you have three behaviors: service behavior, operation behavior, and endpoint behavior. So thank you for watching this tutorial. So I'll catch you up in the next tutorial on consuming a service through a client.